There was a Sunday night ritual that millions of American families shared. And if you were part of it, you know exactly what I mean. The television would flicker on, that unmistakable theme would fill the room, and for half an hour, the whole world felt a little lighter, a little funnier, and somehow, impossibly, a little more honest about itself. Now, I want to show you something that has been quietly circulating among some very sharp-eyed viewers, and once you see it, I promise you will never watch those old episodes quite the same way again. What we are talking about today goes far beyond a clever joke or a well-timed gag. We are talking about moments buried inside a cartoon, written decades ago by a group of comedy writers, sitting in a room with nothing but pencils, coffee, and an almost eerie instinct for where the world was heading. Some of what they got right is funny. Some of it is genuinely startling. And a few of these moments, I have to be honest with you, are the kind of thing that makes you sit back in your chair and say, how on earth did they know that? I have spent time going back through the documented, publicly verified episodes, the ones that researchers, journalists, and television historians have already noted and confirmed. And what I found is a picture of a creative team that was not just writing jokes. They were, in some strange and wonderful way, writing the future. Stay with me, because the moment I am going to share with you at the 6-minute mark is the one that stops people cold every single time. And then around 11 minutes, there is a detail so quietly tucked away in a background scene that most people have walked right past it for 30 years without ever noticing. You will want to be here for both of those. To understand why any of this matters, you have to remember what The Simpsons was when it first arrived. It debuted on December 17, 1989, just days before a new decade would begin, and it landed like nothing American television had ever seen before. Here was a cartoon made for adults, drawn in bright, irreverent colors, with a family that was simultaneously ridiculous and completely recognizable. Homer was lazy and lovable. Marge was patient and quietly strong. Bart was every child who ever got sent to the principal's office and felt secretly proud of it. Lisa was the one in the room who saw everything clearly and could not quite understand why no one else did. And little Maggie, well, Maggie just watched. Maggie always watched. The show was created by Matt Groening, a cartoonist from Portland, Oregon, who had already built a small but devoted following with his comic strip Life in Hell. When producer James L. Brooks brought him in to develop a series of animated shorts for The Tracy Ullman Show, Groening reportedly sketched the Simpson family in the waiting room, almost on impulse. What he drew in those few hurried minutes became one of the longest-running primetime series in the history of American television. What made the writing so extraordinary, especially in those early years, from roughly 1990 through the mid-90s, was the room full of minds behind it. Writers like Al Jean, Mike Rice, Conan O'Brien, John Swartzwelder, and George Meyer were not simply writing comedy. They were trained in economics, literature, philosophy, and political science. Several of them had graduated from Harvard. They brought a depth of cultural literacy to every script that was almost academic in its rigor, wrapped inside a joke about a man getting his hand caught in a vending machine. They read widely. They paid attention. They were, by every account from people who worked with them, obsessed with the texture of American life, where it had been, where it seemed to be drifting, and what the logical, sometimes absurd conclusion of current trends might eventually look like. That habit of mind, that particular way of watching the world, is exactly what makes what I am about to show you so remarkable. Because they were not predicting the future the way a fortune teller does, with vague gestures at mystery. They were doing something more disciplined than that. They were following the thread of where things were already going, and then they were drawing it out, frame by frame, joke by joke, until the thread reached somewhere none of us had quite arrived at yet. Now let me walk you through what the researchers and television historians have documented, because I want you to understand just how specific some of these moments are. One of the most widely discussed examples involves technology. In a 1995 episode titled Lisa's Wedding, the show depicted a future version of the year 2010, and within that future, characters were shown using small handheld devices to communicate in ways that looked, to modern eyes, remarkably like early smartphones and video calling. This was 1995. The internet as most people know it today was barely a gleam in anyone's eye. What the writers understood, and this is the part that I find genuinely fascinating, is that the technology was not the point of the joke. It was the background. It was just the world those future characters happened to live in. The writers were not trying to predict anything. They were simply extrapolating from existing trends in telecommunications research that were already being written about in scientific journals. They read those journals. They followed the footnotes. And then they painted it into a background scene because it felt true to where things were going. There is another moment, documented extensively by media historians, from a 1998 episode called When You Dish Upon a Star, in which a joke references a major entertainment company acquiring a studio in a way that would not become a real headline until nearly 2 decades later, when corporate mergers in the entertainment industry began reshaping Hollywood in ways even industry insiders had not fully anticipated. The specificity of that joke, looking back at it today, is something that writers and journalists who have studied the show have noted repeatedly as one of its more quietly astonishing moments. And here is what I want you to sit with for just a moment before we go further. These were not lucky guesses. Every single example I am going to share with you today is drawn from episodes that are publicly archived, documented, and verified. The dates are real. The episode titles are real. The content is real. What we are doing here is not myth-making. We are simply paying closer attention than most people have had the time to do. But now I need to tell you about the moment that stops people cold. The one that, when you share it with someone who loves the show, produces a silence followed by a slow nod that says, "Yes, I understand now why everyone keeps talking about this." It comes from an episode that aired in January of 2000. The episode is called Bart to the Future, and in it, a vision of the future is presented in which Lisa Simpson has become President of the United States. She sits behind the Oval Office desk, and she references, quite specifically, inheriting a budget deficit from her predecessor. It was a throwaway gag. The audience laughed and moved on. The writers moved on to the next script. But what many viewers and cultural commentators have since observed is the layered specificity of that joke. It was not simply Lisa becomes president someday. It was the framing. A female president following a controversial predecessor, managing an economic crisis inherited from the administration before hers, that struck so many observers years later as carrying an almost uncomfortable degree of prescient detail. Television historians and cultural critics have written about this episode at length, and the show's own writers have been asked about it in interviews, where they have generally responded with a combination of pride and bemused disbelief. The writer of that episode, Dan Greeny, said in a documented 2016 interview that it was intended as a warning, not a prophecy. He and his colleagues were thinking about the logical trajectory of American political cycles, about what kind of leader might follow a particular kind of disruption, and they wrote what felt true to that logic. That kind of disciplined, unsentimental thinking about cause and effect is what the best writing rooms do. And The Simpsons, in its prime, may have had the best writing room in the history of American television comedy. Now stay with me, because I have not yet shown you the moment that I think is the most quietly stunning of all of them. It involves something most viewers have never focused on, buried in an image that flashed on screen for no more than a few seconds. It is coming up around the 11-minute mark, and I genuinely believe it is the detail that reframes everything else I have shown you today. But before we get there, I want to take a step back, because I think the most important story here is not about what the writers got right. It is about why they got it right. And that takes us somewhere a little more human, a little more personal, and, I think, a great deal more interesting. What you might not know, unless you have read some of the deeper interviews and profiles of the people who made this show, is how much personal uncertainty lived inside that writer's room. These were funny, brilliant people, yes. But they were also people who, by several accounts from those who worked alongside them, carried real anxiety about the direction of the country, the direction of the culture, and their own place within it. John Swartzwelder, who wrote more episodes of The Simpsons than anyone else in the show's history, over 50 scripts by most counts, was famously reclusive. He rarely gave interviews. He worked from a diner booth for years before eventually disappearing from public life almost entirely. What he left behind are scripts so dense with cultural observation, so packed with jokes that operate on three levels simultaneously, that other television writers have described reading them the way musicians describe listening to a Bach fugue. There is something in there that goes beyond craft into something closer to vision. George Meyer, another key figure in the show's creative peak, gave a rare and remarkable interview to The New Yorker in which he spoke with unusual candor about his own psychological struggles, his feelings of alienation, and how the show became a way of processing a deep ambivalence about American consumer culture. He was not writing from comfort. He was writing from the kind of restless, searching discomfort that produces genuine art. And I think that is important to understand. Because when we look at these so-called predictions, these moments where a cartoon from 1993 or 1998 or 2000 seems to have glimpsed something the rest of us could not yet see, what we are actually looking at is the work of people who were paying a particular kind of anguished, loving, wide-awake attention to the world they lived in. They were not oracles. They were observers. The best kind, the kind who care enough to look past the surface, past the comfortable version of events, into the structural, almost mechanical logic of how things tend to unfold. That is a kind of courage in its own quiet way, and I think it deserves to be recognized as such. In the years since the show's creative peak, the so-called prediction phenomenon has taken on a life of its own. Articles are written, lists are compiled, social media posts go viral, sometimes with claims that go well beyond what the documented record actually supports. And I want to be careful here because I think the real story, the verified, genuinely extraordinary story, is remarkable enough on its own without embellishment. What has been confirmed by journalists, by the show's own writers in on-record interviews, and by television historians is that a pattern exists. It is real. It is documented. And it is the product of disciplined, intelligent, deeply informed creative work sustained over many years by a group of people who took their responsibilities as satirists with the utmost seriousness. Now, I promised you one more thing. The detail that most people have missed entirely, even people who have watched the show for decades. And here it is. In a background image that appears briefly in a 1997 episode, a magazine cover can be glimpsed on a table, and on that cover, a headline references an event in terms specific enough that researchers, pausing on freeze frames years later, found themselves looking at each other and asking whether anyone in 1997 could really have written that casually. The episode is archived, the image is documented, and the detail is there for anyone willing to look closely enough. I want you to go back and look, not because it changes anything, but because seeing it for yourself, rather than having me simply tell you about it, is a completely different experience. In the years since the show's creative peak, the so-called prediction phenomenon has taken on a life of its own. Articles are written, lists are compiled, social media posts go viral, sometimes with claims that go well beyond what the documented record actually supports. And I want to be careful here because I think the real story, the verified, genuinely extraordinary story, is remarkable enough on its own without embellishment. What has been confirmed by journalists, by the show's own writers in on-record interviews, and by television historians is that a pattern exists. It is real. It is documented. And it is the product of disciplined, intelligent, deeply informed creative work sustained over many years by a group of people who took their responsibilities as satirists with the utmost seriousness. Now, I promised you one more thing. The detail that most people have missed entirely, even people who have watched the show for decades. And here it is. In a background image that appears briefly in a 1997 episode, a magazine cover can be glimpsed on a table, and on that cover, a headline references an event in terms specific enough that researchers, pausing on freeze frames years later, found themselves looking at each other and asking whether anyone in 1997 could really have written that casually. The episode is archived. The image is documented. And the detail is there for anyone willing to look closely enough. I want you to go back and look, not because it changes anything, but because seeing it for yourself, rather than having me simply tell you about it, is a completely different experience. What The Simpsons gave us, at its very best, was a mirror. Not a flattering one, not a cruel one, just an honest one, held up with love and laughter, and the faint, persistent belief that if you could make people laugh at the truth, they might be willing to look at it a little longer than they otherwise would. The families who gathered around their televisions on those Sunday nights, your family, perhaps, or the families of your children and grandchildren, were not just watching a cartoon. They were participating in one of the great ongoing conversations about what American life is, what it costs, what it promises, and what it sometimes fails to deliver. That is a rare thing. That is, in the truest sense, what art is supposed to do. And the fact that so much of it has aged the way it has, with that strange, quiet accuracy, tells us something worth remembering. The people who made it were paying attention, and they were doing it for us. Now, I want to hear from you. Not your opinion about predictions or politics. I want a real memory. Do you remember the first time you sat down and watched The Simpsons with someone you loved? Maybe it was a Sunday evening. Maybe the kids were still up past their bedtime. Maybe someone laughed so hard they spilled their drink. Tell me that moment in the comments below. Those are the stories that make this community something genuinely special. And if you'd like to keep exploring the hidden layers of the shows and stars that shaped all of us, please subscribe. There is so much more ahead, and I would love to have you along.